The greenhouse effect is something like this. Imagine the Earth sitting in space, and the sun, let's imagine that bright television light is the sun. The amount of sunlight falling on the Earth warms the Earth. The warm Earth then radiates back into space to cool itself off. And the temperature of the Earth, one would think, is determined by the balance between the amount of sunlight that is absorbed and the amount of radiation that's radiated to space. If you do that calculation, we know how bright the sun is, we know how far away the Earth is from the sun, we know how much sunlight is absorbed by the Earth. If you do that calculation, you would predict, and it's done in elementary astronomy and meteorology courses, you find that the temperature of the Earth would be 35 degrees centigrade cooler than in fact it is. Something's wrong with the calculation. What's wrong is that we've forgotten something. That the Earth is not airless, that there is a thin layer of atmosphere that surrounds the Earth. Some of that atmosphere is in front of us, right here, in this room. So I can see people in the back of the room. I hope people in the back of the room can see me. Our eyes work in visible light, ordinary visible light. The air, except in places like Los Angeles and Mexico City, is transparent to ordinary visible light. On the other hand, in the infrared part of the spectrum, beyond the color red, wavelengths longer than red, the atmosphere is not fully transparent. And at some wavelengths, some colors in the infrared, it's opaque. And that means that if we have lots of infrared absorbing gases in the atmosphere, they may not block the sunlight that's coming in to warm the Earth, but they will block the infrared radiation that the Earth radiates back to space, and then the atmosphere acts as a kind of blanket, warming the Earth. Some molecules in the air, like oxygen and nitrogen, the most abundant ones, don't absorb, almost not at all, in the infrared. So they are not greenhouse gases. But other molecules, like water vapor, or carbon dioxide, or those CFCs I talked about a moment ago, do absorb in the infrared and are greenhouse gases. The more of those gases, the more infrared absorption, the more blanket, and everything else being equal, the more the temperature of the Earth should rise. There's no question that since the Industrial Revolution, we have been pouring CO2 and other such gases, carbon dioxide, CO2, and other such gases into the atmosphere. Recently, because of the exponential growth of our technology, we've been pouring many more of those gases into the atmosphere, including new gases that were never known in nature, like CFCs. And all the calculations show that the temperature of the Earth should be increasing. We do not know precisely by how much. There is not yet perfect agreement on these matters. But the bulk of the calculations show that temperature increases of a few degrees centigrade in the average temperature of the Earth should happen sometime in the next century.
There's not a single verified or checked out report which is at all connectable with the possibility of extraterrestrial life. It doesn't say that I think extraterrestrial life is impossible. Quite the contrary. I think that many of the stars in the sky have planetary systems. We know enough now about the origin of life to make it appear likely that life arises naturally on the vast bulk of these planets. It's possible, but by no means certain, that life on many of these planets evolves into beings which are as advanced as we, or more advanced. And I don't see any reason why we can't imagine that there are civilizations thousands or millions of years in advance of ourselves capable of technical feats that we can hardly imagine. If you would believe, as the flying saucer cultists would have us believe, that the majority of the saucer reports are due to visitations, then you have a very strange situation. That means several spaceships are coming to the Earth over interstellar distances every day, as if all the anthropologists in the world were to converge on one of the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean because they just invented the fishnet there or something. I think it's much more reasonable if you want to speculate on the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence, that there are very rare visits from extraterrestrials to the Earth. There's no evidence for this. I just say that's not implausible. But to have several visits a day, I think, is straining credulity. I think a key to what's behind the real belief in flying saucers is most easily obtained if you look at the contact myths. There are several hundred people in the United States who claim to have had personal contact with the inhabitants of flying saucers who have landed. And if you examine these myths, you find that there are some peculiar regularities. The inhabitants of saucers are benevolent. I mean, they're really concerned for our well-being. They're omnipotent, extremely powerful, omniscient, extremely knowledgeable, and they often wear long white robes. Now, this combination is something I've heard in another context. This isn't science, this is religion. And what I suspect is happening is this. We live in very unsettled times. It used to be possible to believe in a personal, benevolent, powerful, all-knowing God who cared about individuals who you could pray to. But now, there's very few people who really believe that, I think. Science, for good or for ill, has destroyed a lot of the traditional theologies. And yet people have the same needs to believe that they always did, perhaps more so because of the times we live in. Well, the flying saucer myths are a really clever compromise. It's a way of having beings that come from the sky, that are worried about us, that are powerful, that are going to step in and prevent us from destroying ourselves, as we very well might, and yet have it in the cloak of science, so that no one can say nonsense that doesn't match science. It's all very pseudo-scientific. I would think that that at least for the contact myths, and probably for a lot of the events of people who just see things they don't understand flying overhead, that what's involved psychology and theology, and not so much the physical sciences.
And you can see it. This is, it looks like more than a dot, but it is in fact less than a pixel, a single picture element in size. In this color picture you can see that it is slightly blue, and this is where we live, on a blue dot. Astronomy has always been said to be a humbling experience, and I think these pictures underscore that point. And the next slide. Oh, no, it was lightning fast. Can we go back to that? That's it. So here are the 6 of the 9 planets imaged in this portrait. The 3 smallest planets, Mercury, Mars, and Pluto, we were unable to photograph. The appearance of the Earth in this pseudo-sunbeam is just an accident. It was no special significance is to be attributed to a beam of light lighting it up. All, of course, are in reflected sunlight. Well, on that blue dot, that's where everyone you know and everyone you ever heard of and every human being who ever lived out their lives. It's a very small stage in a great cosmic arena. And again, just speaking for myself, I think this perspective underscores our responsibility to preserve and cherish that blue dot, the only home we have.
I think that's very important, the idea that we have information stored outside of our bodies. For most of the history of life on this planet, the organisms had almost all the information they had to deal with in their genes, hereditary information, instinct. Then about maybe 100 million years ago, a little longer ago than that, there came to be a reptile that for the first time in the history of life had more information in its brains than in its genes. And that was a major step symbolically in the evolution of life on this planet. Well, now we have an organism, us, which can store more information outside the body altogether than inside the body, and that's in books and computers and television video cassettes. And that extraordinarily expands our ability to understand what's happening and to manipulate, control our environment if we do it wisely for human benefit. The whole idea of what happens when you read a book I find absolutely stunning. Here's some product of a tree with little black squiggles on it. Right. You open it up, and inside your head is the voice of someone speaking who may have been dead 3,000 years. And yet there he is talking directly to you. What a magical thing that is.
The story of Noah's Ark is, of course, a story. The books of the various great religions, Buddhist, Hindu, Islamic, Jewish, Christian, and many others, are filled with stories. That doesn't mean we are to interpret them literally. And there are all sorts of problems with the Noah's Ark story, one of which is kangaroos. How did the kangaroos get to Australia if you literally believe the story of Noah's Ark? So I'm sure you meant that in a light tone, and my response is likewise. How to keep kids in school? Well, kids, I believe, are fundamentally very smart. And if they see school being taught by people who themselves are not interested in it, people who cannot do very well at teaching, if what they're being taught has no practical application, then why should they do it? So, for example, there's an awful lot of kids graduating high school who go into entry-level jobs in the service economy, waiting on tables, slinging hash, and so on. Now, do they get more money if they were good in second-year algebra? The answer is no. And they understand that. If there were more jobs that required this kind of education, there would be more kids who would go into that kind of education with some enthusiasm. If there were a connection between how well you did in school and how fast your salary increased later, as there is in many countries, kids would be much more interested.
Do you think that there's life anywhere else in the universe?
Well, think is a strong word. If you look at how many other worlds there are, how many stars in the Milky Way galaxy, how likely it is that most of them most of them have planets, how many other galaxies there are, it seems the height of human arrogance to imagine that this planet is the only inhabited world. But at the same time, we don't know of life elsewhere yet. We're just at the very earliest stages of exploration, and we've not found life anywhere else. We've sent spacecraft, as I said before, to a wonderful, exquisite array of other worlds. We've learned an enormous amount from them. We find on some of them the chemicals necessary for the origin of life, you know, the stirrings, the intimations of life, but no sign of life. We've also used big radio telescopes to see if anybody is sending us a radio message, and both of those efforts have not yet succeeded, so we haven't found life elsewhere. I would think a universe in which we are the only living things is much more incredible than a universe just burgeoning, overflowing with life. But we can't be sure. It's an experimental question. It has to be addressed experimentally. And that's one of the reasons that I'm such an advocate for sending spacecraft to other worlds and for using large radio telescopes to listen for signals. I want to say there is a historical perspective which suggests, as bad as our problems are, the nuclear arms race, the environmental issues, as bad as all that is, there is some reason for hope. There was once slavery on the planet. It is largely gone. There was once human sacrifice. There was once the divine right of kings. There was lots of stuff that today we consider...
Oppression of women.
Absolutely. I'm sorry I didn't say that. But all of that is changing. And we can change these issues too, because our lives depend on it. We're smart enough, we're dedicated enough to do it, but not by sitting on our duffs. We have to really work. Here's this spacecraft that has flown by the Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune systems. Is on its way, astonishingly, to the stars, a triumph of human engineering. We turn the cameras back and take a photograph of the planet from where it came. And we can barely see it. Here it is, a fragile, delicate, pale blue dot, and that's where we live. That's where every human has ever lived, and you can see the vulnerability at a glance. And that gives a humbling and, I think, character-building sense of where we are.
Humbling because it says that we're only one small portion of something that is enormously large?
Absolutely. And let me say a word about what that is. This dot is one of 9 planets that goes around a humdrum star that lives at the outskirts of a perfectly ordinary galaxy, which is composed of 400 billion other stars in a universe of maybe 100 billion galaxies. And recent thoughts suggest this universe one of a very large number, perhaps an infinite number of other closed-off universes. In that context, what is the chance that we are the center or the point of the universe? The solar system was a lot more traffic in it than there is now. And a lot of that debris we know from the exploration of Halley's Comet, for example. Comets are very rich in organic matter. So the stuff of life was falling on the Earth. Now, is that the hand of God or not? Well, if you believe in God, God established the physical laws of the universe, and chemistry is a consequence of physics, so all those molecules that led to life were made by God. It's possible to believe that. I'm not opposed to that idea, but I just say there is no evidence for it. And where there's no evidence, I say keep an open mind. Don't commit yourself in the absence of compelling evidence. My feeling, Charlie, is that it's not that pseudoscience and superstition and New Age so-called beliefs and fundamentalist zealotry are something new. They've been with us for as long as we've been human. But we live in an age based on science and technology with formidable technological powers.
Science and technology are propelling us forward at accelerating rates.
That's right. And if we don't understand it, by we I mean the general public, if it's something that, oh, I'm not good at that, I don't know anything about it, then who is making all the decisions about science and technology that are going to determine what kind of future our children live in? Just some members of Congress? But there's no more than a handful of members of Congress with any background in science at all. And the Republican Congress has just abolished its own Office of Technology Assessment, the organization that gave them bipartisan, competent advice on science and technology. They say, we don't want to know. Don't tell us about science and technology.
Surprising. The danger of all this. I mean, you know, this is not the thing that...
There's 2 kinds of dangers. One is what I just talked about, that we've arranged a society based on science and technology, in which nobody understands anything about science and technology. And this combustible mixture of ignorance and power, sooner or later, is going to blow up in our faces. I mean, who is running the science and technology in a democracy if the people don't know anything about it? And the second reason that I'm worried about this is that science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking, a way of skeptically interrogating the universe with a fine understanding of human fallibility. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along. It's a thing that Jefferson